I'll briefly tell sort of how the Johnson tapes came about. Johnson taped from literally the moment he took office. This was probably the most closely held, well, one of the most closely held secrets in the White House.
Could I interrupt for one quick second? It seems to me, though, in listening to the tapes, and I am addicted to them, that he forgot that he was taping.
That's it. Because his original idea was, if he thought if there was a senator who double-crossed him on the telephone, he'd have this exact record. I mean, that never happens nowadays, but it occasionally did in the 60s. So he'd have an exact record, so he could call up Dirksen and say, "Have you told me yesterday?" and I quote, and have it pretty exact. And Dirksen would wonder why his memory was so good. But didn't want anyone to know that he was taping people in the Oval Office and elsewhere on the telephone. And these poor secretaries, including Juanita Roberts, had to work at night where no one would see them transcribing these tapes. It was hard work. They were working hard already. And when I started this project, I figured I could probably just use a lot of their transcripts. Until about 10 days into the Johnson administration, there's a transcript of a call between LBJ and the Speaker of the House, John McCormick, whom Cokie's father knew extremely well. And according to the transcript, Johnson says to McCormick, "John, I can't talk to you long because in my waiting room I got waiting for me a pack of bastards." So I figured if that's what he said, I'll put it in the book, but I actually listened to the tape. And I listened closely, and what he actually said was, "Can't talk to you long because I've got waiting for me in my waiting room the Pakistan ambassador." Which shows you how difficult this work is. And it sort of made sense that she would have written "pack of bastards"
walking the Appalachian Trail thing.
Yeah, I mean, "pack of bastards" was the kind of language he used. And also I sort of figured they had worked for him for 20 years, and they knew that before he became president, much more common among his visitors were packs of bastards than Pakistan ambassadors.
They were probably both true.
Yeah, I think probably. But that's what you have to do. So anyway, people didn't know about it. The tapes were made. Johnson went back to Texas. They were quietly brought to the LBJ library, locked up. They were used a little bit for his memoirs. Very few people who worked for him even then knew that many of the quotes in his memoirs come from tapes. But anyway, a few weeks before Johnson died in January of 1973 of a heart attack, he knew he did not have long to live, had very bad cardiovascular disease, and in those days there wasn't much you could do about it, and his doctors told him to put his affairs in order. So he called in a woman named Mildred Stiegel, who'd worked for him for years, and she knew about the tapes, and he said, you know about the tapes, they're locked up in a vault here in the library, people don't know about them, but we've got to do something. And he said to her, "I want you to make sure that when I die, these tapes are locked up for 50 years, not open to anyone or disclosed to them. 50 years after my death, who's ever director of the Johnson Library then should listen to them and decide whether they should be destroyed, sanitized, or opened." And I think his vote probably would have been for sanitized, but sanitized would have been 95% of the tapes would go. Every belch would not have reached the ears of all of us, and every piece of bad language and more serious things than that. And so after Johnson died, she did an affidavit saying these were his wishes, and that was basically filed in the Johnson Library for years. And in the early 1990s, Harry Middleton, who was very close to Lady Bird Johnson, devoted to LBJ's memory, began to think, why should these things be locked up for a half century? They're a very important historical resource to understand Johnson. God knows what's on the tapes. He hadn't heard them, but he knew that if they were open, they'd have to be open, almost all of them. So he went to Lady Bird and he said, "This decision is yours to make. We will do, basically what you'd like us to do. We recommend that you open them, but if you don't want to do that, we'll talk about that." And she said, "Open them, even though I'm sure that many of the things on these tapes I will be very displeased by." And she had no idea what could be there.
And she had an idea of what to fear.
Absolutely. Some of which she was right in fearing because they are in the tapes. But the point is, they opened. And the point I'm getting to at great length is, if you had not had a National Archives official, director of the LBJ Library like Harry Middleton, who loved Johnson, loved Lady Bird, but also knew that his job was not to make sure the family liked him. It was also to make sure that the history of this period was properly written. If you didn't have someone with that kind of sensitivity and that kind of passion, there's a very good chance that these tapes might have been closed for 50 years and conceivably might have been destroyed. And I think all of us can tell you what an unbelievable loss that would be to our understanding of not only Lyndon Johnson, but that whole period.
I want to come back to that whole question of the families and what they release and the whole secrecy issue, because it's ongoing. But I want to get Drew in here first, because I am fascinated by this Whitman story. Did you come knowing that this diary existed? You just happened, but were you already interested in the question of? I know your wonderful Civil War book before this, Mothers of Invention, but were you just looking to do something more on the Civil War, or you were interested in the subject of death in the Civil War?
I was interested in the subject of death in the Civil War, and one of the major resources are the papers of the quartermaster of the United States Army, because the quartermaster was responsible for materiel and for hauling things and for providing coffins and so forth and so on. So I began to explore those record groups and those papers, and this I more or less stumbled across. But I also was the beneficiary of many hints and directions from National Archives staff, and I remember when I was at the very beginning of this project, Mike Music, whom some of you may remember, a wonderful archivist who knew all about wars and sort of all the papers that had to do with wars. And so I sat down and talked to him, and he said, you know, I have kind of an interesting thing to show you. And he sat me down and said, I'll be right back. And he just plunked this box in front of me. And what the box contained was correspondence surrounding a particular incident where Montgomery Meigs, who had been the quartermaster general during the war, several years after the war, took a photograph that had been taken at the very end of the war in a military hospital here in Washington. It was a photograph of the face of a dead person. And this dead person was a soldier who had died with $360 in his possession. That's a lot of money in that time. And if he'd been just an average soldier with no money, I don't think anyone would have paid much attention. But they took this photograph in hopes eventually of perhaps finding who this money should go to. Well, what this box contained was the drawings that were made from this photograph in order to publish it. You couldn't just publish a photograph. The technology was not up to that in the late 1860s. So a drawing made from this photograph that got published in a number of northern magazines in the years after the war, including Harper's and others. A very powerful rendition of a face with a beard. You can't really tell the person's dead, but knowing that he's dead, you could see that he would be. This was published with the information. This is a man who died and was found with $360 and an ambrotype of a little boy. Does anyone know who he is? And dozens of women write in saying, but you know, it's at first you might think they want the money, but what you realize is they just want to know what happened to their loved one. And they write the most compelling notes of, this looks like my husband. I hadn't heard from him since 1862. He didn't have any children, but he did love children, so he might have carried around an ambrotype. And letter after letter of individuals trying to resolve their unresolved grief. And it was just a box that was plunked down in front of me that told such a story of how many Civil War dead were never identified, how years after losing loved ones, people were still desperately trying to come to some kind of resolution of their grief, some kind of knowledge, and a sense of what loss meant in that Civil War context.
Didn't Clara Barton do a lot to try to mark the graves?
She did, and she worked at Andersonville to mark graves, and she also ran an office here in Washington, the Office of Missing Men, where she would just publish lists of missing men and say, does anyone know where this person is? And she managed to match up some tens of thousands of individuals with information.
Which gets me to another question, which is your earlier book, Mothers of Invention. One problem I have actually had with the archives with the early women is there are no women's records because it's government records, and they were not citizens, basically. Have you found the same kind of problem?
For the book about women in the South during the Civil War, I found a lot here. And probably the richest collection is the letters to the Confederate Secretary of War. And this collection contains hundreds of letters from women across the South writing to the Secretary of War, describing their situations, saying, please detail my husband home, please help me in some way, this is what I'm suffering from. And so it's a real portrait of the female experience on the home front, archived in official papers because they wrote of their plight to the Secretary of War.
So they wrote to an official person?
Yes, and one of the most memorable of these letters is written, or not written, but yes, I guess written, by a blind person who writes in this very studied script that she's learned in the School for the Blind about how terrible it is for her to be alone and blind during the war, and so written in that sense. And then many of these letters are actually not written, but dictated by individuals who are unable to write and find someone in their community to dictate them to.
I'm about to turn this over to you all, so please be thinking of questions. And what do we have? We have microphones in each aisle, but I want to go back to what I was saying to Michael, which is this question of secrecy, which we are still dealing with, particularly with presidents and presidential papers, and even for presidents of the era of John Kennedy, some problems with families and having everything that we want to have out there.
There's always going to be a tension. It's particularly marked with the presidential libraries, but other areas of the archives too, which is that in a presidential library, they're dependent on the family and the entourage in a number of ways, to get papers, in some cases to get financial support for programs. The life of the people who work in a presidential library is easier if they have a reasonably friendly relationship with the president's family. On the other hand, that's not always the easiest thing to do because sort of like someone once told Mrs. John Foster Dulles that he wanted to write a warts and all biography of her husband, and she said, "What warts?" And that's sort of the attitude that you'll find in many immediate members of a president's family and official
I'm surprised
family.
you find it in a wife, actually.
It varies from case to case, as you well know. But anyway, so, there's always that tension there, and it comes back to what I was saying earlier. You really have to have people working for this place who have integrity and understand what their mission is rather than taking a dive to get along with, the president's daughter-in-law or something like that, which has occasionally happened in history.
Have you run into this in doing the documentaries
everyone's
as well,
did.
David?
Well, I recently showed some, it was Lyndon Johnson's, what was his 100th anniversary year, and I was down at the library showing excerpts from the Johnson film, and I showed this opening sequence, maybe a little bit longer, and when it started going, hey, well, actually just before it ran, Lyndon Johnson came in and sat down right next to me. And I said, oh my God, because, well, I feel like when you talk about Johnson, there's so many sides to him and you've got to bring them all out. And I wasn't sure what she was going to be like. And when that clip ran and it started to say, hey, LBJ, how many men did you kill today? Which was a hard little piece of sound to find, believe it or not. She leaned over to me and whispered in my ear, I was in the White House. And I was living upstairs, and I heard those chants, and my husband was in Vietnam. But the way she said it made me feel like everything was going to be okay. That I was going to be able to say whatever I wanted about her father, because she'd processed it.
I wouldn't be so sure about that.
It felt like that. Put it this way, maybe I was wrong, but I did say whatever I wanted. It just felt so intimate, that moment, and the tone in her voice. So, I don't know, it felt to me that she had processed that and it was going to be fine.
If I could interject for a
Yes.
second, it reminds me the first time I ever gave a speech to the Johnson Library was in 1994. Got through the speech. I think the first question from some Johnson loyalist in the audience was, when are you historians ever going to realize that LBJ was entirely right about Vietnam? And I opened my mouth to speak when my eyes fell on the smiling and expectant face of Lady Bird sitting in the front row, which I was nervous about at the time, but as I got to know her,
No, she was.
she had
She
huge
was-
respect for people's judgment.
And she was, I mean, it was her decision, put it all
Absolutely.
out there. And I mean, think how brave that was. I'm
No,
not sure
and her
anyone
feeling was she loved and admired her husband, and the preponderance of what came out would help his reputation. And it really did.
It has, yeah.
But most presidential relatives would not
Have
feel
that
that
courage.
way. Yeah.
We have a Harvard man here.
Recent graduate, you might remember me from the UC meetings where we begged you for more things for the students.
She can
But,
change your record if you ask a hostile question.
Yeah, please don't. My diploma's with my mom, it's staying there. But my question is, when I was taking one of my core classes, actually, the question came up, what should we preserve? And I think that that's an important question, especially in this day and age. It's no longer a day and age where you publish something, it's a really big deal. It's more, there's web blogs, there's Twitter pages, there's Facebook profiles, there's archives of web pages and Gmail. And the question is important, I think, because not only has our technology advanced in our ability to store data, but there may be a time when our technology has also advanced in our ability to digest and analyze data. I mean, right now it takes an incredible, brilliant historians to figure out what did Whitman do and all these different things, but we might have a day where we have more intelligent processing analyses that can bring in all this data. So should we start now saying, wait, before they change that web page, let's archive it. Before they, let's take the Gmail server and open it up in 100 years when people are dead and we can look at their emails and we can see what did people think at that time and have this massive amount of data, because we might be able to analyze massive amounts of data that we're not able to do now. So,
Who wants to take that?
Well, I think it really should be Adrienne Thomas,
Yes.
who's I don't want to put her on the spot.
You have the
Our acting
problem.
archivist. But you're absolutely, we should all take a whack at this, but you're absolutely right. We have to really do more rather than less. And it's not the most glamorous part of the archives for civilians, but that's the biggest problem we face, is to find ways of doing exactly what you're saying.
But see, I think it's terribly important to save it all. The fact is that even as awful as Twitters and blogs and all of that are, and they are, is that it is a written record. And for years we didn't have that. For years we had everything on the telephone. And when I wrote a book a while back on marriage, where I had a chapter on pioneer marriages. And the pioneer diaries were things like, awoke at 5, baked 9 loaves of bread, was delivered of a son. And, that's not longer than an email or a Twitter, but it tells you a story of a life. And I really do think I advise families to print out the emails from family members. Do it on recycled paper. But really, if you look at it all, even though it's not beautifully written or anything, it tells a story. And if you leave it to, and this is very much contrary to the way I normally feel about covering politics, for instance, if you leave it to the experts, people will pick the things that they think are important. So for instance, Charles Francis Adams' selection of Abigail Adams' letters are very different from my selection of Abigail Adams' letters, and really, really different from my selection of Louisa Catherine Adams' letters, his mother. Louisa Catherine Adams' letters, most of them have not been published. Happily, the Massachusetts Historical Society is about to. But these are the serendipitous moments, and I'm going to ask you each. I mean, you talked about the Whitman thing, and that is a fabulous one. But here was my fabulous serendipitous moment in writing my last book, which was sitting reading Louisa Catherine Adams' letters to old John Adams. He was a widower. She was the wife of the Secretary of State and running John Quincy Adams' campaign for president, which she called it. She called it my vocation to run his campaign. And God knows he could. And so she is, writing these chatty letters to amuse John Adams. And it's the year of the Missouri Compromise. And Congress stayed in session much longer than usual because of the Missouri Compromise. And it was a disaster. The city was running out of food, running out of water, everything, because they were here so long. Finally, they go home. They go home in May. They normally went home in March. In June, she goes to a meeting of the trustees of the orphan asylum. And they say to her, we're going to need a new building next year. And she says, why? And they said, because Congress had been in session so long that they had left 40 women who would be in need of their services at the orphan asylum. You know, and she was just furious. There were only like 180 members of Congress. And 40 pregnant women left behind by the Congress. And she says to John Adams, you know, I proposed a petition to the next Congress that they use the $2 a day that they had voted themselves as an increase in pay to be put aside for a foundling institution. Well, that letter to me tells you a huge amount about what was going on in Washington at the time, about who the people were, about the life, about her, about John Adams running for president, all of that. No historian would have published that letter for, I mean, ever until modern times.